The streets of Metro District were always buzzing with the kind of life that seemed larger than any single individual. The hum of neon lights flickered in the distance, reflecting off wet asphalt after a rainstorm. The sounds of car engines, hushed conversations in alleyways, and the occasional screech of a siren filled the air, an urban symphony that was at once chaotic and strangely calming. To the outside world, Metro District was just another part of the city, a neighborhood like any other. But for those who knew the undercurrents running through it, it was a battleground of power, ambition, and survival. And then there was Devon, Booksmart Boss, Harris, a name that would soon echo through the underground world in ways few could have predicted. But what was it that made a freshman, barely out of high school, someone who had never seen the inside of a prison cell, suddenly become one of the most feared figures in the district? The answer lies in a combination of intelligence, ambition, and a deep understanding of the rules that govern this world, rules not learned from books, but through the streets themselves. To the people who would come to know him, Devon wasn't just another street thug looking to make a name for himself. He was something different, a fresh face, yet one with a sharp mind, a quick wit, and an almost unnerving ability to predict moves before they happened. His story, like many great gangster sagas, wasn't about power being thrust upon him, but rather the quiet, calculated way in which he seized control from the shadows. At first, it seemed impossible that someone like him, smart, calculated, but with no real ties to the criminal world, could possibly rise to the level of power he would eventually command. But what if the mind of a student became the mind of a kingpin? What if the fresh-faced freshman could outsmart, outmaneuver, and outlast the most dangerous figures the district had ever seen? It all started, as these things often do, with a simple twist of fate. Devon Harris wasn't born into the life of a gangster. He wasn't raised by mafia families or shadowy figures from the underworld. In fact, he was a college student, bright, driven, and determined to succeed in a world where survival often meant more than just good grades. Metro District was far from a college town. It was a labyrinth of shadows, street corners, and businesses that catered to the darker side of the city. But even in a place as dangerous as this, Devon's mind was his greatest weapon. While others around him were building their reputations through brute force or old family ties, Devon chose a different path, one rooted in intellect, strategy, and an understanding of human behavior that would eventually give him the edge he needed. At first, it was all about the hustle. Like so many others in Metro District, Devon wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His family struggled, living in the kind of apartments where you could hear the neighbors' arguments through the thin walls, and where money was tight enough to make even the simplest luxuries feel out of reach. But Devon wasn't the type to accept a life of limitation. He understood that the key to getting ahead wasn't just about working hard, but about understanding the system, knowing who to trust, and when to make your move. The first time Devon walked into the darker side of the district, it wasn't as a thug looking for trouble, but as a young man seeking opportunities that others either overlooked or were too afraid to chase. He wasn't looking for street fights or backroom deals, but he was keenly aware that knowledge of how the underworld worked could set him apart from his peers. And that's where his story began to diverge from the typical gangster narrative. It wasn't long before the people in Metro District started noticing him, this young, quiet kid who had an uncanny ability to stay calm under pressure. His intelligence didn't go unnoticed either. Where others might have blundered through a situation, acting on impulse or emotion, Devon took his time, observing, calculating his next steps. Whether it was negotiating over a debt or talking his way out of a potentially dangerous encounter, Devon's approach was always the same: think first, act second. And slowly, as his reputation grew, so did his circle of influence. It wasn't the raw physical intimidation that many of his peers relied on, but the precision of his mind, his ability to understand situations and people better than anyone else, that began to set him apart. But while his intellect would become his greatest strength, it also made him a target. There's always a certain kind of danger in standing out, whether in a world of criminals or scholars. The more he advanced, the more enemies he accumulated. Not just from the gangs that ran the streets, but from those who saw in him the future of Metro District, and who feared what would happen if he succeeded. And yet, Devon remained undeterred, finding ways to navigate the fine line between ambition and survival, playing the game with the same quiet intensity that had served him so well in the classroom. As his influence grew, so did his understanding of the complex web of loyalty, power, and betrayal that governed the underworld. He learned early on that no one could be trusted completely, not even those closest to you. But what made Devon so dangerous was his ability to stay ahead of the game, always planning several moves ahead. His mind, sharp and calculated, was the ultimate weapon in his ascent. And as the stakes grew higher, Devon would face challenges and choices that would test his intelligence, his loyalty, and his very humanity. What happened next would shock even his allies, but for Devon, it was simply another step in his rise to power. He wasn't just some kid trying to fit in with the local gangs, he was about to become something more. And the world would soon learn the true meaning of the name, Booksmart Boss. The neighborhood of Metro District wasn't the kind of place you'd find in travel brochures or glossy magazine spreads. It wasn't a place where dreams were built or where hopeful souls wandered in search of a better life. It was a place shaped by its own rules, a sprawling urban jungle that had no regard for the innocent or the naive. There were no fairy tales here. Just the cold, hard reality of survival. The kinds of places where hope often faded into the background noise of sirens and streetlights, where ambition was measured by how much you could hold on to, or take from someone else. In the middle of it all, however, there was Devon Harris. A young man who, unlike most of those around him, had the spark of something different, a fire that would soon ignite his ambition into something extraordinary. Devon wasn't born with the typical advantages that many of the men he would come to call enemies had. His family didn't have the wealth or connections to buy their way into influence, and they certainly didn't have the reputation to give Devon a shortcut into the world of Metro District's criminal empire. No, Devon came from a different world altogether. A world where schoolwork, reading, and ambition were things to be praised. A world where success was earned through grades, not through street fights. Growing up, Devon was the type of kid who didn't quite fit in with the usual crowd. He had the kind of academic focus that other kids couldn't even begin to understand. While they were out playing ball in the streets or getting into trouble, Devon was nose deep in books, his mind constantly swirling with ideas. He wasn't a loner by choice, rather, he found solace in the quiet spaces, the libraries, and the books that offered him an escape from the harshness of the world around him. His dreams weren't so much about escaping his neighborhood as they were about elevating himself from it, rising above the noise, the chaos, and the constant struggle that defined so much of life in Metro District. But despite his academic successes, Devon wasn't blind to the realities of his surroundings. He was keenly aware of the lives that others around him were leading, the lives that seemed more immediate and exciting. There was a certain allure to the fast pace of the world just outside his door, the flashy cars, the loud music, and the men who stood tall on street corners with their cigars and gold chains. To a kid like Devon, these figures were a contrast to the quiet, hard-working people in his neighborhood who were just trying to get by. They were larger than life, untouchable, and seemingly invincible. But even then, there was something in Devon that set him apart. He didn't just want to be like them, he wanted to outsmart them. Growing up in Metro District meant that you couldn't ignore the pull of the streets for long. While many tried to stay away, Devon was different. He had the kind of sharp intellect that others didn't recognize at first, an ability to read situations, people, and environments with an accuracy that bordered on instinct. Where others saw problems, Devon saw solutions. Where others saw obstacles, he saw opportunities. And though he had dreams of college and a future that didn't involve petty crime or drugs, the undercurrents of the criminal world were never far from his mind. It didn't take long for Devon to realize that the world around him wasn't just a backdrop to his story, it was a system, a complex network of power, greed, and ambition. And to survive in it, he would have to understand how it worked. While most of his peers focused on sports or parties, Devon dove deep into the street's unofficial curriculum, the codes of conduct, the whispered names of power, the business deals done in dark alleyways, and the men who controlled it all. He saw patterns that no one else did, how one wrong move could result in a life lost, or how a well-placed word could earn respect in a world where respect was currency. His academic background, his love for strategy, and his understanding of how things worked gave him an advantage that others didn't have. While many of the men he would meet later in life had street smarts and hard-earned experience, Devon had something else, an innate ability to think critically, plan ahead, and analyze situations with a cool detachment that often gave him the edge. His mind wasn't clouded by emotion or impulsiveness. Where others acted on instinct, Devon worked with precision. He was a tactician, a planner, someone who understood the art of patience. And for a young man in Metro District, this kind of thinking was both rare and dangerous. Yet, despite his growing awareness of the criminal world and his intellectual capacity, Devon was still at a crossroads. He could have easily stayed on his academic path, worked hard, graduated, and maybe even gone on to lead a successful life in a field that didn't involve the streets. But something in him craved more. More than the quiet, predictable life he was heading towards. More than the idea of blending in with the crowd, of playing it safe. Deep down, Devon knew that he wasn't made for a life of mediocrity. He was meant for something greater. And while the streets of Metro District held the kind of danger that could break a man, they also held the keys to something else: power, respect, and influence. The decision to enter the underworld wasn't a simple one. It wasn't a choice made in the heat of the moment or out of desperation. It was a choice made with the kind of cool calculation that defined Devon's character. He didn't dive into the world of crime with wide-eyed naivety. Instead, he approached it like a puzzle he was determined to solve. He knew the risks, he understood the consequences, but he also knew that if he played his cards right, he could come out on top. After all, the game had rules, even if those rules were unspoken. And so, with the quiet determination that would come to define him, Devon took his first steps into the world of Metro District's criminal empire. He wasn't running from something, he was walking towards something, a future that only he could see. A future where his intellect would be just as valuable as his street connections. A future where the Booksmart Boss would emerge not just as a player in the game, but as the one who would change the game entirely. Little did the people around him know, but a storm was coming. And it wasn't a storm driven by muscle or force, it was a storm driven by a mind that saw opportunities others couldn't. It was a storm that would reshape Metro District's criminal underworld. And for those who underestimated him, the wake of that storm would leave nothing but devastation in its path. Devon's early steps into the underworld were tentative, almost calculated, like a chess player making the first few moves of a carefully planned game. He wasn't one to rush headfirst into the dangerous world of the district's criminal figures, yet he knew that in order to survive, he had to understand the rules. And those rules, he quickly learned, were not written down anywhere. They were unwritten, passed down in whispers, and learned through experience that was often brutal and unforgiving. His first real brush with the world of organized crime came through a man named Raul, the Owl Alvarez, a notorious figure in Metro District who had a reputation for watching everything with a keen, unblinking eye. Raul was a fixer, someone who was called when things went wrong, when deals needed smoothing over, or when someone needed to disappear. But Raul wasn't just about solving problems, he was about control. He controlled information, people, and situations with an ease that Devon couldn't help but admire. Raul wasn't a traditional gangster. He didn't rely on brute force to make his mark. Instead, he used his network of contacts, his ability to manipulate situations, and his deep knowledge of the criminal world to stay ahead. And for someone like Devon, this was the kind of power that was both fascinating and necessary to understand. It was during a chance meeting with Raul that Devon's fate in the underworld began to take shape. Raul wasn't impressed by Devon at first. He'd seen countless young, eager faces try to make a name for themselves, most of them ended up either dead or in jail. But what set Devon apart was his calm demeanor, his ability to hold a conversation with anyone, and his relentless pursuit of knowledge. Raul was intrigued, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he decided to take Devon under his wing, teaching him the ropes of the business. One of the first lessons Devon learned from Raoul was that knowledge was power. Raoul didn't care how strong someone was or how much muscle they could throw around. What mattered was whether you knew how to navigate the labyrinth of criminal dealings, how to spot the right opportunities, and, perhaps most importantly, how to make your enemies believe they were winning, all while you were steadily taking the game for yourself. This was a subtle kind of power, one that required patience, calculation, and a keen understanding of human nature. For someone like Devon, who had spent years studying people and their motivations, it was a natural fit. Raoul taught him the art of negotiation, the delicate balance of presenting an offer that seemed too good to refuse while ensuring that the terms always tilted in your favor. He showed Devon how to read people's body language, how to gauge their reactions to certain words or phrases, and how to build an aura of quiet authority. Raoul wasn't interested in teaching Devon how to pull a trigger or throw a punch. He was teaching him how to wield influence like a weapon, how to manipulate situations without anyone ever realizing they were being manipulated. But Devon wasn't blind to the dangers of this new life. Every deal, every word exchanged in the shadows, was fraught with risk. The underworld was full of people who would lie, cheat, and kill to protect their own interests. And as much as he learned from Raoul, Devon quickly realized that even the most well-laid plans could fall apart in an instant. Trust, he was told, was a luxury that only the naive could afford. Loyalty was even rarer. In the criminal world, friends were often enemies in disguise, and allies could become adversaries at the drop of a hat. His first real test came when he found himself caught in the middle of a turf war between two rival gangs, the Galloway crew, known for their ruthless enforcers, and the Black Vultures, a group of drug dealers who had been expanding their reach across the district. The two gangs were fighting over territory, and the chaos that followed threatened to spill out of control. Devon found himself in the middle of it all when Raoul asked him to act as a mediator between the two sides. The task seemed simple at first: sit down with both sides, listen to their grievances, and find a way to bring about a peaceful resolution. But Devon quickly learned that there was no peace to be had between these two factions. The Galloway crew had no interest in compromise, and the Black Vultures were more interested in asserting their dominance than finding common ground. The meeting, arranged in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the district, was tense from the start. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the heavy scent of gun oil. Devon sat at the head of the table, trying his best to exude calm confidence. Raoul had taught him how to read a room, how to make everyone feel like they had the upper hand, even when they didn't. But as the conversation went on, it became clear that both sides were more interested in violence than in diplomacy. Devon remained composed, carefully selecting his words, playing one side against the other without them even realizing it. He used the knowledge Raoul had given him, sowing seeds of doubt between the two factions, making them question each other's loyalty. By the end of the meeting, the turf war was still brewing, but Devon had managed to broker a temporary ceasefire, a victory in its own right, even if it was only a pause in the inevitable conflict that would follow. This was Devon's first taste of real power, the power to control situations, to make people see things your way without them even knowing it. And though the meeting had been tense, Devon felt a thrill in the quiet success of it all. It wasn't about the violence or the intimidation, it was about the ability to maneuver through the chaos, to find a way to come out on top, no matter the odds. But Devon was no fool. He knew that the world he had entered wasn't a place for second chances. Every move mattered. Every decision carried weight. And with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. But what he also knew, deep down, was that he was built for this. He wasn't some kid trying to play in the big leagues. He was a strategist, a thinker, someone who understood that the path to power wasn't paved with blood and brutality, but with careful moves and calculated risks. And what happened next, no one could have predicted. As he made his way deeper into the world of the Metro District, Devon began to realize just how quickly things could change, how fragile the world of organized crime really was. But for now, all he needed to focus on was the game. And he was just getting started. The streets of Metro District were like a vast, interconnected web of opportunity and danger, with every corner holding secrets that could either make you a fortune or destroy you. As Devon's presence in this world grew, so too did the complexity of his dealings. What began as simple lessons in negotiation and observation quickly evolved into something much more, something that demanded not just intelligence, but a deep understanding of the human psyche. The underworld wasn't just about who had the most power or the sharpest blade, it was about knowing people, knowing what they wanted, what they feared, and what they would do to protect both. One of Devon's first real challenges came when he was asked to handle a situation that would test not only his strategic mind but also his moral compass. It wasn't just about making a deal, it was about understanding what was at stake and how far one could push without tipping the delicate balance of power. The job involved a man named Clarence "Clash" Harris, a mid-level drug dealer whose operations had been encroaching on territory that wasn't his. The problem was simple: Clash had become too greedy, and in doing so, he'd ruffled the wrong feathers, specifically, the feathers of a powerful figure named Tony Carbone, a kingpin whose reputation for ruthlessness was known throughout the district. Tony wasn't the kind of man you crossed unless you were willing to pay the price, and Clash had made that fatal mistake. Tony's men had already delivered a warning to Clash, one that had been loud enough to send a message, but not quite enough to break him. He had, however, become increasingly unpredictable, erratic in his decision-making, and a threat to the stability of the larger operation. To make matters more complicated, Tony had given Devon an ultimatum: either he handled the problem with Clarence, or Tony would find someone else who could do it more permanently. And for someone like Devon, who was still proving his worth in this world, there was no room for failure. Raul the Owl Alvarez, ever the teacher, saw this as an opportunity for Devon to learn a vital lesson in how to balance power and diplomacy. He made it clear that this was not a situation where brute force would solve the problem. Instead, Devon was tasked with the delicate art of negotiation, using everything he'd learned to subdue an adversary without causing a war. The challenge wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Devon had to understand the fear and pride that motivated Clash, the desperate need for control that often overtook men like him. The fear of losing everything, and the pride that wouldn't allow him to back down. Devon's first step was to track down Clash. It wasn't difficult: Clash's drug dealings were well known, and his temper was notorious. But catching up with him was only part of the battle. Devon knew that in order to make an impact, he had to understand who Clash really was, what made him tick. He spent time watching, observing how Clash interacted with his crew, how he reacted under pressure. Every detail mattered. He watched how Clash treated his associates, how he belittled those beneath him, how he tried to maintain an image of invincibility. It wasn't hard to see that Clash was a man driven by insecurity, the kind of person who overcompensated for his lack of true power with arrogance and hostility. When Devon finally made contact with him, it wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet meeting, staged in an inconspicuous back room of an old bar in the less frequented part of the district. The room smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke, the dim light casting long shadows on the worn wood of the walls. Clash, dressed in his typical flashy attire, eyed Devon warily. He was used to people either bowing to him or confronting him with threats, but Devon didn't do either. He sat across from him, calm and composed, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. For hours, they talked, about money, about power, about loyalty, and about respect. Devon didn't offer any immediate solutions. Instead, he let Clash talk, let him dig his own hole deeper. And through every word, every exchange, Devon was watching, calculating, listening for the cracks in Clash's armor. It wasn't long before Devon recognized the root of Clash's problem: his overwhelming need to prove himself. To someone like Devon, this wasn't just an obstacle, it was an opportunity. He knew that if he played his cards right, he could turn Clash's insecurity into leverage, make him see the bigger picture without forcing him into submission. What Devon did next was subtle, almost invisible. He offered Clash a deal, a way to save face, a way to keep his operation intact without crossing Tony Carbone completely. The deal wasn't just about money or territory, it was about making Clash feel like he was still in control, still a player in the game. Devon didn't demand compliance outright, instead, he made it seem as though Clash's decision to step back from certain territories was his own idea. The power of suggestion, the ability to make someone feel like they were in control when they weren't, that was Devon's true strength. The negotiation wasn't easy, and there were moments when Clash's temper flared, when he threatened to walk away from the deal entirely. But Devon stayed calm, never raising his voice, never losing his cool. It was this composure that eventually won Clash over. He realized that Devon wasn't just another negotiator, he was someone who understood the game, who could give him a way out that didn't involve humiliation or ruin. By the end of the meeting, Devon had secured a compromise that not only satisfied Tony Carbone but also allowed Clash to save face with his own crew. It was a victory for everyone involved, one that left Devon with a quiet sense of accomplishment. But this wasn't the end of Devon's journey into the underworld. If anything, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. He had learned that the criminal world wasn't always about the loudest voice or the strongest fist. Sometimes, the most effective weapon was patience, observation, and understanding. The ability to read a person, to understand their fears and desires, to offer them something they thought they couldn't have without them ever realizing it. And while this victory was small in the grand scheme of the criminal world, it was a critical step in Devon's rise. He had proven to Tony, to Raoul, and to everyone else watching that he was more than just a student of the game, he was a force to be reckoned with. He wasn't just surviving in Metro District, he was beginning to thrive. Yet, even as Devon felt a sense of pride in his work, he understood that this was only one battle in an endless war. For every deal he made, for every negotiation he won, new challenges would arise. The district was a world in constant motion, a place where loyalty was fickle, and where enemies were never far away. But Devon was no longer just a player in this world. He was learning to control the game, to make the rules work in his favor. And with each passing day, his reputation grew, a reputation built not on violence, but on the kind of quiet, calculating strategy that would eventually make him one of the most feared men in Metro District. The events following Devon's delicate negotiation with Clarence "Clash" Harris were a turning point, one that would set him on a path from which there would be no turning back. His reputation in Metro District began to solidify, but with that reputation came the inevitable attention of those who saw his rise as a threat. Success in the underworld wasn't measured by how many deals you made, it was measured by how well you could protect what you'd earned and maintain your position without drawing the wrong kind of attention. It was in the aftermath of his dealings with Clash that Devon would first encounter the dangerous allure of power. But it wasn't just the power that would prove to be a challenge, it was the paranoia that often accompanied it. As Devon's influence grew, so did his involvement in the larger, more intricate operations that powered Metro District's criminal empire. No longer just a negotiator or a mediator, Devon began to play a more direct role in orchestrating deals between the city's most powerful figures. He started to gain access to meetings and gatherings where the district's most influential leaders discussed matters of money, territory, and loyalty. It was a dangerous game, one that required a constant awareness of who was watching, who was listening, and, most importantly, who could be trusted. One evening, Devon was invited to a private dinner with a group of influential businessmen and gangsters, the kind of gathering where only those with true power were welcomed. The table was set in the back room of an exclusive club, far from the prying eyes of the public. It was an elegant setting, one that stood in stark contrast to the brutal dealings that took place in the alleyways and warehouses of the district. As he entered the room, Devon could feel the weight of the eyes on him, older men, more experienced, more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Their cold stares spoke volumes. The message was clear, he was being watched, not just by his mentors, but by potential rivals who were sizing him up for what he could bring to the table. The conversation that night revolved around a new opportunity, an expansion into neighboring districts, territories that had previously been off-limits due to their proximity to rival organizations. For someone like Devon, this was a chance to prove his mettle. But it wasn't the business itself that caught his attention, it was the way the men around the table spoke. There was a quiet unease beneath their words, a kind of tension that Devon immediately picked up on. These were men who had seen too much, done too much, to trust easily. Each of them was aware that even a small misstep could send everything crashing down. What Devon realized as the night wore on was that the underworld was not just about alliances and rivalries, it was also about control. These men didn't just want money or power. They wanted influence over every aspect of their world, and they feared losing that control. This fear, he realized, was the driving force behind the decisions made in this room. The stakes were higher than he had imagined, and the consequences of failure were too great to ignore. As the conversation continued, Devon saw an opening. He wasn't just an observer anymore, he was a participant, shaping the future of Metro District's criminal landscape. His chance came when the discussion turned to the distribution of resources, specifically, the drugs that fueled much of the district's illegal economy. Devon, with his keen understanding of logistics and strategy, offered a suggestion that no one had anticipated. He proposed a system of coordination between the factions, a shared network of distribution points that would ensure stability and avoid unnecessary conflict. It was a bold move, one that required careful negotiation and the ability to sway opinion without appearing to challenge the existing power structures. But Devon's calm demeanor and strategic thinking won the room over. By the end of the night, his plan was agreed upon, and Devon had secured a crucial role in the operation, positioning himself as a key figure in the expanding empire. But success, as always, came with a price. The more involved Devon became in these larger operations, the more he realized how fragile his position truly was. The underworld, with its webs of alliances and betrayals, was not a place for the faint of heart. Each new step forward came with new dangers, and the paranoia that ran through the veins of the criminal elite began to seep into Devon's own thoughts. He became hyper-aware of every gesture, every word, every look exchanged in his presence. He couldn't afford to make a single misstep. His growing influence made him a target for those who sought to either control him or eliminate him. The very same qualities that made him valuable also made him dangerous in the eyes of others. In the weeks that followed, Devon began to notice subtle shifts in the way people treated him. Allies, once loyal, began to distance themselves, while new faces started to appear in the shadows, watching him from a distance. It was during one of these quiet moments, as Devon sat in his office overlooking the district, that the full weight of the situation hit him. He realized that the power he had so carefully cultivated was fragile, subject to the whims of others who were just as eager to rise as he was. One particular evening, as Devon made his way through the streets after a long day of negotiations, he was confronted by a familiar face, Raúl, the Owl, Alvarez. Raúl had been a mentor, a guide, but now his demeanor was different, colder. Raúl's sharp eyes scanned the street around them, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he motioned for Devon to follow him down a dark alley. The tension was palpable, and for the first time, Devon felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. "You're moving too fast," Raúl finally spoke, his voice low. "You're making enemies without realizing it. You're getting too much attention, and that's dangerous." Devon could feel his pulse quicken. He had known that his rise would come with challenges, but hearing it from Raúl, someone who had seen it all, was a sobering moment. Raúl's warning wasn't just a casual observation, it was a statement of fact. The underworld didn't tolerate those who rose too quickly or too conspicuously. The more power you gained, the more you had to watch your back. "What do you suggest?" Devon asked, trying to mask the unease that suddenly churned in his stomach. Raúl's eyes narrowed, and he looked over his shoulder before leaning in closer. "Slow down. Don't get ahead of yourself. You think you've got control, but the truth is, you're just one bad move away from losing it all." Devon nodded, understanding the gravity of Raúl's words. But even as he absorbed the warning, he knew something deep down, he couldn't slow down. Not now. Not when he had come so far. But the truth was undeniable, the game was becoming more dangerous by the minute, and the paranoia that came with power was something he would have to learn to live with. The higher he climbed, the more isolated he became, and the more he realized that in the world of Metro District, no one was ever really safe, not for long. As Devon's name continued to echo through the underworld, his rise became both a testament to his intelligence and a cautionary tale. Power was never as secure as it seemed, and in the criminal world, everyone was always looking over their shoulder, waiting for the day their enemies would strike. Devon's rise in the criminal world, despite his careful navigation, was inevitably leading him into the darker corners of Metro District, places where even the most calculating minds could lose their grip on power. While his intellect had carried him through many challenges, he was soon to face a trial that would test not just his strategic thinking but his ability to manage the growing web of loyalties, betrayals, and the ever-present threat of violence that loomed over him. It was in these murky waters that Devon encountered what would become one of the defining moments of his career, a situation that no amount of negotiation could fix, a conflict that demanded action. The trouble began when one of his key associates, a man named Marco "Slick" Johnson, who had been instrumental in managing the distribution networks, made a critical mistake. Slick, ambitious but hot-headed, had been given control of an important sector of Metro District's drug trade. He was trusted by Devon, who had seen in him a potential ally, someone who could help expand the empire. Slick had always been an erratic character, charismatic, but often reckless. It was this recklessness that led him to cross a line that no one in the business could afford to cross. Slick had been trying to cut a deal with a rival faction that had long been considered untouchable, an up-and-coming cartel that had recently entered the scene in the northern part of the city. This cartel was known for its brutal tactics and for refusing to follow the established rules of engagement. They were the kind of people who would kill without hesitation, leaving bodies in their wake without a second thought. They didn't play by the rules, and Slick, in his arrogance, thought he could make a deal with them, bypassing Devon and the other power players in the district. What he didn't know, or perhaps didn't care to realize, was that the rules were there for a reason. Disrespecting those who held power could have disastrous consequences. When Devon caught wind of the situation, it was already too late. The cartel had decided to make their move, and Slick, in a misguided attempt to impress them, had facilitated a transfer of drugs that had been meant for Devon's operation. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a direct attack on the stability of everything Devon had worked for. Slick had given the cartel a foothold in Metro District, an unforgivable mistake in the eyes of those who controlled the city. Devon's reaction was cold, methodical. He immediately gathered his most trusted men and began to plan how to resolve the situation. This wasn't just about teaching Slick a lesson, it was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could undermine his authority. Slick had jeopardized everything Devon had worked for, and now he would have to make an example of him. But it wasn't as simple as just killing him. Slick was still valuable, and Devon knew that his loyalty, or lack thereof, would set the tone for the future. He needed to handle this with precision. Devon's first step was to locate Slick, who, by now, had gone into hiding. Slick wasn't the type to face his problems head-on, he was a runner, always looking for the quickest way out of trouble. Devon, however, had no intention of letting him escape. He wasn't going to let this be a simple story of a man running from his mistakes. No, this was going to be a statement, a moment that would cement Devon's control over the district. The search for Slick took Devon through the most dangerous parts of the city, into the heart of the chaos where loyalties shifted like sand. He knew that in a world like this, nothing was ever as it seemed, and that trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered. As he ventured further into the underbelly of the district, Devon found himself confronted by an eerie silence, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. He had heard rumors about Slick's whereabouts, and his instincts told him that the man was hiding in the old warehouse district, a desolate part of the city known for its abandoned buildings and labyrinthine alleys. It was there, in the shadow of crumbling structures, that Devon finally found him. Slick was holed up in an old office building, trying to lay low. He wasn't alone, though. The moment Devon stepped into the building, he could feel the weight of the situation. Slick had already made his peace with his fate, or at least, that was the impression he gave off. But Devon wasn't there to end things quickly. No, this was about control, about making it clear that loyalty in the underworld wasn't a suggestion, it was a necessity. The confrontation was tense, the air thick with the kind of tension that only two people who know each other's darkest secrets can share. Slick, his eyes wide with fear, tried to plead his case. He claimed that he had made the deal with the cartel out of desperation, that he thought it would make him untouchable, but Devon wasn't buying it. The story was too rehearsed, too full of holes. He could see through Slick's lies, the fear in his eyes telling him everything he needed to know. Slick wasn't trying to make peace, he was trying to save his own skin. "Devon, you've got to understand," Slick started, his voice trembling. "I wasn't thinking straight. I thought I could make it work. I thought I could make us both untouchable. You know I'm loyal, man. I made a mistake." Devon stood motionless, his gaze cold. He wasn't interested in excuses. "You didn't just make a mistake, Slick. You put everything I've worked for in jeopardy. You risked everything for a quick payday, and you thought no one would notice. You thought I wouldn't find out. But I did." His voice was quiet, measured, yet it carried a weight that made Slick flinch. The silence that followed was deafening. Devon stepped closer, his presence filling the room. "The question now isn't whether I'm going to kill you, Slick. It's whether I'm going to make an example of you, or if you'll be able to fix this. But make no mistake, you're out of time." Slick's desperation grew as he tried to convince Devon that he could fix the situation, that he could undo the damage he'd caused. But Devon wasn't interested in quick fixes. This wasn't something that could be solved in a single conversation or a temporary alliance. Slick's mistake was too great, and Devon knew that in this world, weakness couldn't be tolerated. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic shootout or a violent confrontation that resolved the situation. It was a quiet, calculated decision. Devon made it clear that Slick would no longer be a part of his operation. But he didn't kill him. Instead, he gave Slick one last chance. He would leave the district, disappear into the shadows, and never return. If Slick survived outside the safety of the district, it would be on his own terms, and Devon would be watching from afar. If he returned, however, it would be a death sentence. It was a decision that sent ripples through the underworld. Devon had made his point, even those closest to him weren't immune to his wrath. Loyalty was everything in this game, and anyone who betrayed it would pay the price. Slick's fate was sealed, but it wasn't as clean as a simple death. Devon's way was one of control, of shaping his environment with cold precision, and it was a message to everyone watching: in Metro District, loyalty could never be taken for granted. As Devon's authority continued to grow, so too did the weight of the decisions that came with it. The Metro District, once a mere battleground of competing factions, was now becoming his domain, an empire that he had carefully nurtured, built brick by brick, through strategic alliances and calculated risks. But with power came not just respect, but enemies. The more influence Devon gained, the more others began to view him as a threat. As his reach extended into more and more sectors of the criminal underworld, the rival factions that had once tolerated his existence began to see him as an obstacle to their own ambitions. It wasn't long before Devon's empire became the focal point of a larger, more dangerous game. The uneasy peace that had existed between Metro District's criminal powerhouses was beginning to crack. At the heart of this conflict was a figure that had, until now, remained largely in the shadows: Thomas T-Bone Caruso. Known for his ruthless approach to expansion, Caruso had made a name for himself by taking out anyone who dared to challenge his authority. But unlike others who preferred to keep their dealings behind closed doors, Caruso was a showman. He was loud, brash, and made his presence known in the most public of ways. His ambitions stretched beyond just drug dealing or extortion. He wanted control over every aspect of the city. And in his eyes, Devon was standing in his way. T-Bone's first move against Devon came subtly, like the first flicker of a spark before a fire. It started with small sabotage, rumors planted in the right ears, whispers in the wind that suggested Devon wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. At first, it was nothing more than a slight inconvenience, supply routes delayed, shipments diverted, but soon, it became clear that these were not isolated incidents. Someone was intentionally targeting Devon's operations, and the deeper he dug, the more he realized that the mastermind behind it all was T-Bone. Devon knew that in the world he inhabited, power wasn't just about money, it was about perception. If people started to believe that he was losing control, that his operations were vulnerable, then his entire empire would start to crumble. T-Bone was attacking him in the only way that would make a real impact, by hitting him where it would hurt the most, his reputation. The first direct confrontation between Devon and T-Bone took place one evening in a bar on the outskirts of the district, a place where the city's criminal elite often met in hushed tones, away from prying eyes. The air was thick with tension as Devon walked into the dimly lit room, his eyes scanning the familiar faces of associates and rivals alike. He knew that the stakes were higher than they had ever been, but he wasn't the kind of man to back down. If T-Bone wanted a fight, Devon would give it to him on his terms. T-Bone was already seated at a back table, surrounded by his usual entourage, muscle, enforcers, and a few trusted lieutenants. The man himself was larger than life, his presence immediately commanding attention. His wide grin and booming voice were a stark contrast to Devon's more reserved demeanor, but that was the very thing that had made T-Bone so dangerous. He didn't just play the game, he reveled in it. The confrontation was inevitable, it was simply a matter of when and where. "Devon," T-Bone greeted, his voice dripping with false charm. "I was wondering when you'd show up. Been hearing some things about you. Funny how people start talking when they think you're slipping." Devon's gaze was unwavering as he took a seat opposite T-Bone. He wasn't intimidated, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, a recognition that this was a pivotal moment. If he showed any sign of weakness, it could be the beginning of the end. "I don't know what you're talking about, T-Bone," Devon replied coolly, his voice steady. "But it seems like you've got something on your mind. Spit it out." T-Bone leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the table as he stared at Devon, sizing him up. "Let's not play games. You and I both know the score. Your little empire's been shaking, and people are starting to take notice. They're not as loyal to you as you think, Devon. And when the money's not right, people look for another way out." He paused for effect, his grin widening. "I'm just here to offer an alternative. You can keep fighting, keep trying to hold on to that crumbling throne of yours, or you can work with me. I'll make sure you stay at the top, as long as you're willing to play by my rules." The offer was as simple as it was dangerous. T-Bone wasn't just asking for control over a few parts of the district, he wanted to consolidate power, to bring Devon's operations under his influence. For Devon, this wasn't just a matter of ego, it was a matter of survival. If he accepted, he would be giving up his autonomy, his ability to make decisions freely. He would be allowing T-Bone to take over the reins of his carefully constructed empire. On the other hand, if he refused, he would be facing an all-out war, with the full force of T-Bone's brutal tactics behind it. The tension in the room was palpable as Devon weighed his options. He knew that backing down wasn't an option. He had built his name on strength, on control, and to show any sign of hesitation now would be to give T-Bone exactly what he wanted, proof that Devon was weak. So, Devon did what he did best, he played the long game. "I don't make deals with people who don't respect the rules," Devon said slowly, his eyes narrowing. "And you've broken every one of them, T-Bone. You've tried to undermine me, you've tried to manipulate the system, and now you want me to fall in line. That's not going to happen." For a moment, T-Bone's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He had underestimated Devon's resolve. "You're making a mistake, Devon," he growled. "You'll regret this." Devon stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "I don't think so, T-Bone. But let me make this clear, if you want a war, you'll get one. And I'm not the kind of man you want to cross." The meeting ended with a cold, silent tension hanging between them. Devon knew that this was just the beginning of what would become a bitter and bloody conflict. T-Bone had made his move, but Devon had no intention of backing down. This was a fight for control over Metro District, and he wasn't going to let anyone take what was his. Over the coming weeks, the underworld would watch with bated breath as the two men prepared for the inevitable clash. T-Bone had the muscle, the audacity, and the resources, but Devon had something that was equally valuable: intelligence, strategy, and the ability to outthink his enemies. The battle for dominance in Metro District had begun, and Devon knew that he had to remain one step ahead. The next move would be crucial, and he was determined to make it count. The conflict between Devon and T-Bone escalated quickly, and as the tension mounted, it was no longer just a battle of words or intimidation. In the underworld, the stakes were always life and death, and both men knew that the only way to truly settle matters was through action. Devon had spent years meticulously building his empire, and he had no intention of letting T-Bone tear it down. Yet he also knew that he could not afford a full-scale war, not yet, not when the repercussions could destroy everything he had worked for. He needed to outthink T-Bone, to strike when the time was right. Devon's strategy had always been to remain several steps ahead of his adversaries, and this conflict with T-Bone would be no different. He knew that T-Bone was an impulsive man, quick to act on his aggression and ego. This, in Devon's eyes, was both a strength and a weakness. T-Bone's bluster made him predictable. While the muscle that T-Bone had accumulated in his rise to power was formidable, it was his lack of subtlety that would ultimately be his downfall. Devon understood the importance of patience, of planning each move with surgical precision. In this case, it was about finding a way to undermine T-Bone without ever needing to directly confront him. The first step in Devon's plan was to sow doubt among T-Bone's ranks. While T-Bone might have been a larger-than-life figure, his organization wasn't as unified as he would have liked to believe. Devon knew that the more power a leader amassed, the more people he had to control, and the harder it was to keep them all loyal. T-Bone's bravado might have won him the admiration of some, but others were growing wary of his chaotic leadership. Devon's informants had kept him well informed about the shifting dynamics within T-Bone's crew. Word had reached him that there were some cracks in the foundation, some discontent brewing beneath the surface. This was where Devon could strike. By subtly amplifying the whispers of discontent, by playing on the growing uncertainty within T-Bone's ranks, he could fracture T-Bone's power base. He knew that fear, when coupled with greed, would often lead men to abandon their allegiances. Devon had always been skilled at manipulating these emotions, and he would use them to his advantage. In the days that followed the meeting at the bar, Devon's men began quietly working their angles. Trusted associates within T-Bone's crew were approached, not with threats, but with opportunities. It wasn't a matter of brute force, it was a matter of presenting alternatives. One by one, key players in T-Bone's operation were offered positions under Devon's command, with the promise of more power, more wealth, and greater security. At the same time, Devon orchestrated a series of carefully timed events designed to shake T-Bone's confidence. He disrupted T-Bone's shipments, but in such a way that it appeared as if it were the work of outside forces, rival gangs, perhaps, or even law enforcement. He made sure that T-Bone would see these events as signs of weakness, as evidence that his grip on the district was slipping. The first significant blow came when one of T-Bone's main supply routes, a key artery in his drug distribution network, was hijacked. The operation was clean, too clean. The attackers had left no trace, no evidence of who was responsible. For T-Bone, it was a waking nightmare. This wasn't a random hit, it was a targeted attack designed to send a message. T-Bone immediately assumed that Devon was behind it, even though there was no direct evidence linking him to the heist. But in the world they inhabited, perception was reality. The mere suggestion that Devon was making moves against him sent T-Bone into a frenzy. His next reaction was predictable: he doubled down on his muscle, calling in reinforcements from other parts of the city to shore up his operation. T-Bone's reaction wasn't one of strategy, it was a knee-jerk response, driven by anger and fear. He gathered his most loyal soldiers, preparing for war, convinced that Devon was moving against him directly. But Devon, ever the strategist, was already one step ahead. While T-Bone was busy assembling his forces, Devon had already made his next move. He contacted his own allies within the district, subtly building a coalition of those who had grown disillusioned with T-Bone's aggressive methods. Some had long been waiting for an opportunity to undermine T-Bone, and Devon was offering them a chance to act without ever having to fire a shot. As T-Bone's paranoia grew, Devon's network of spies and informants fed him constant updates. He knew the time was coming when T-Bone would make a move. But Devon wasn't prepared to give him the satisfaction of a direct confrontation just yet. He would let T-Bone make the first aggressive move, and then he would strike back, when the moment was right. That moment came sooner than expected. One night, in a move that was as reckless as it was predictable, T-Bone decided to send a message to Devon, by hitting one of Devon's major businesses. It wasn't just a small operation, it was a cornerstone of Devon's empire, a club that served as a front for money laundering and a key revenue stream for the whole district. T-Bone knew that hitting this business would send a clear signal that he was no longer willing to sit back and wait. He wanted war, and he wanted it now. The attack was swift and brutal. T-Bone's men stormed the club, causing chaos and fear in the streets. They set fire to the building, ensuring that nothing would remain. It was a bold statement, a calculated move to show Devon that he was no longer in control. But Devon wasn't the type to act rashly. Instead of retaliating immediately, he bided his time, waiting for the situation to unfold further. In the aftermath of the attack, Devon gathered his most trusted men. There would be no panic, no rash decisions. T-Bone had made his move, and now it was Devon's turn to respond, not with brute force, but with precision. It was time for the final phase of his plan to unfold. Devon knew that the longer T-Bone's aggression continued unchecked, the more his enemies would circle in. The cartel, the rival factions, even those within his own crew who might be considering switching allegiances, these were all variables that Devon needed to control. He couldn't afford a war that would weaken him across the board. But he could, and would, make sure that T-Bone's bluster ended in failure. As the fire at the club still smoldered, Devon sent word to his key allies. They had made their move. Now it was time for Devon to execute his own plan and turn the tables. He wasn't going to take T-Bone down with a single blow. He would dismantle him piece by piece, each move calculated and deliberate. The war had begun, but it was far from over. Devon's response to T-Bone's attack on his club wasn't just a reaction, it was the beginning of a calculated, multi-layered counteroffensive. The destruction of his business had been a bold move on T-Bone's part, but Devon wasn't about to let it be a decisive blow. He understood that in the world they lived in, every move had to be measured, every reaction carefully planned. To strike back without thinking could lead to disastrous consequences, not just for him, but for the fragile alliances he had carefully cultivated over the years. The fire at the club was still burning, the charred remnants of his business symbolizing the aggressive escalation of this war. For many, it would have been a devastating loss. But for Devon, it was simply another challenge to overcome. He saw the destruction not as the end of something, but as an opportunity to redefine the terms of the conflict. His first move was to tighten his grip on the remaining parts of his operation, his businesses, his associates, his alliances. He needed to show not just T-Bone, but everyone in the district, that his empire wasn't as vulnerable as it might have seemed. He wasn't just about the flashy displays of power, his real strength lay in the quiet, unshakable control he had over his network. Devon's first order of business was to call a meeting with his closest allies, those who had been with him from the start, the ones who trusted him implicitly. These were the men and women who had stood by him through thick and thin, and now, more than ever, he needed their loyalty. As he gathered them in a secure location, his thoughts were clear and focused. The attack on the club was nothing more than a provocation, a move designed to get under his skin, to draw him into a violent retaliation. Devon had no intention of playing into T-Bone's hands. Instead of seeking revenge immediately, Devon decided to take a different approach. He understood that a war fought with pure aggression would only benefit T-Bone. The more T-Bone stirred up chaos, the more Devon would have to focus on containing it. Devon's strategy was to play the long game. He would force T-Bone to exhaust his resources, spread his forces thin, and ultimately make him overextend in ways that would weaken him. The first step in this strategy was to reassert control over the district's operations. Devon couldn't afford to lose face, especially not after T-Bone's brazen attack. So, he ordered his men to secure all the businesses that still remained under his control. It wasn't just about the money, it was about sending a message to T-Bone and anyone else who might be watching. Devon's empire was not crumbling. On the contrary, it was solidifying. His hands were still firmly gripping the reins. But re-establishing control wasn't enough. Devon needed to remind his rivals why he had risen to power in the first place. That meant taking the fight directly to T-Bone's remaining strongholds, but in a way that wasn't immediately obvious. It wasn't about an all-out assault, it was about destabilizing T-Bone's operations and eroding his base of support. To do this, Devon relied on his network of spies, informants, and allies within T-Bone's crew who had grown disillusioned with their leader. These individuals were the key to Devon's strategy. They knew the inner workings of T-Bone's empire, they understood his weaknesses, and they were eager to undermine his authority from within. Devon had already made moves to quietly turn T-Bone's men against him. Some of T-Bone's lieutenants had been approached with offers they couldn't refuse, promises of greater power, more wealth, and a chance to work for someone who, in their eyes, had proven himself as a far more capable leader. These were not just empty words. Devon had the resources to make these offers legitimate. His long-standing relationships with suppliers, business owners, and even some of the city's politicians gave him the leverage he needed to sway T-Bone's subordinates. The most critical part of Devon's plan was to create division within T-Bone's inner circle. T-Bone may have been a master at intimidation, but he was also a man who demanded loyalty through fear, not respect. The cracks in his leadership were beginning to widen, and Devon was the one pushing them open. Over the next few weeks, whispers of discontent began to spread within T-Bone's ranks, further feeding the paranoia that already plagued him. The lieutenants and soldiers who had once been fiercely loyal to T-Bone started to question his judgment. They saw the cracks in his empire, the growing tension, and they began to wonder if following him was really the best option. The tipping point came one night when Devon's men orchestrated a daring raid on one of T-Bone's warehouses. It wasn't just a theft, it was a message. They didn't steal goods, but rather, they sabotaged the warehouse's infrastructure, destroying equipment, stockpiles of cash, and documents that could expose T-Bone's most illicit dealings. When T-Bone arrived on the scene, he found nothing but chaos. His most trusted men were left scrambling, unable to explain how such a clean, precise strike could have occurred under their watch. To them, it felt like betrayal, but the truth was even worse. They were starting to realize that Devon's reach extended far deeper than they had ever imagined. The damage to T-Bone's operation was significant, but perhaps even more damaging was the blow to his reputation. In the underworld, reputation was everything. When news of the attack spread, it sent ripples through the district. People started to talk, and with each passing day, T-Bone's control seemed to slip further away. His allies grew more nervous, his soldiers more uncertain. Devon had found the perfect way to destabilize T-Bone's empire without ever having to fire a shot. Despite all of this, T-Bone refused to admit defeat. His pride wouldn't allow it. He doubled down on his efforts to eliminate Devon, calling in more muscle from outside the district. But Devon knew that this would play right into his hands. The more T-Bone threw at him, the more he would be forced to spread his resources thin. T-Bone was weakening, slowly but surely, and Devon could feel the tide beginning to turn. As the weeks wore on, the tension continued to rise. The conflict between the two men had reached a point of no return. Devon knew that the final showdown was inevitable, but he also knew that he had put the pieces in place. He had waited, he had planned, and now T-Bone was on the defensive. The time was coming for Devon to make his ultimate move, to deliver the blow that would end this conflict once and for all. But for now, he remained patient, his every action calculated, his focus unwavering. He had put T-Bone on the back foot, and there was no way he was going to let up. As the weeks dragged on, Devon's influence continued to grow, but so too did T-Bone's desperation. Devon had played a masterful game of chess, moving his pieces with precision, manipulating events and people to his advantage. But T-Bone, a man whose pride was as big as his ambition, was refusing to bend. He had taken a few hits, suffered setbacks, but his resolve remained strong. Yet, beneath his bluster, there were cracks. T-Bone was feeling the weight of the pressure closing in. And as much as Devon wanted to capitalize on this weakness, he understood the importance of patience, because the final move had to be perfect. In the underworld, everything was cyclical, power moved from one hand to another, and the price of betrayal, ambition, and pride was steep. For Devon, his rise had been slow and deliberate, built on careful calculations and quiet loyalty. T-Bone, however, had always been a man of immediacy, someone who believed that by sheer force of will, he could hold on to everything he'd taken. But now, that strategy was falling apart. Devon's careful disruptions had caused a ripple effect, not just among T-Bone's enemies, but within his own crew. The tension in the district was palpable. The streets that had once felt like T-Bone's personal domain now seemed uncertain because his control was slipping. There were rumors that his inner circle was beginning to unravel. Devon's quiet sabotage had worked its magic. T-Bone's allies, the men who had once sworn loyalty to him, were now beginning to doubt whether he could keep the empire together. The question wasn't whether T-Bone would lose his grip, it was when. But Devon knew that victory wasn't about waiting for T-Bone to fall apart. It wasn't enough to let the cracks grow. Devon had to ensure the final blow would land without hesitation. He began to ramp up his efforts, using the very chaos T-Bone had created to his advantage. The time was fast approaching when T-Bone would be forced into a corner, a place where Devon could finally end the war once and for all. But there was one thing that weighed heavily on Devon's mind. T-Bone was unpredictable. And unpredictability could be a dangerous thing. If Devon underestimated T-Bone's desperation, the consequences could be catastrophic. He'd seen it before in other rivalries. Desperate men did desperate things, and in the mafia world, that often meant violence without caution. Devon couldn't afford to let that happen. Not when everything he'd built was hanging in the balance. To further destabilize T-Bone, Devon began making calculated moves to discredit him among the district's power players. Devon knew that the real power in the district wasn't just in the streets, it was in the boardrooms, in the backrooms, in the deals that were made with politicians and business owners. He used his extensive connections to orchestrate subtle, but effective, attacks on T-Bone's reputation. He spread rumors among the business elite that T-Bone was losing control. He leaked information that painted T-Bone as unreliable, volatile, and unable to manage his growing empire. The whispers started small. At first, they were nothing more than idle talk. But as the weeks passed, the rumors gathered strength. Business owners who had once been hesitant to cross T-Bone now began to look elsewhere for protection. Politicians who had turned a blind eye to T-Bone's dealings started asking questions. It wasn't long before T-Bone's influence began to wane in places where he had once been untouchable. Devon didn't just want to defeat T-Bone on the streets, he wanted to ensure that when the final battle came, T-Bone would have no support left, no allies to back him up. He wanted to make sure that every aspect of T-Bone's empire was fractured beyond repair. The more Devon spread doubt, the more T-Bone's enemies grew in number. Devon had turned the tide from a street-level war to a battle for influence in the very corridors of power. And T-Bone had no idea that the battle was already being lost. Meanwhile, Devon's business was thriving. Despite the sabotage and occasional disruptions, his operations were running more efficiently than ever. His loyalty to his crew and his calculated expansion into new territories ensured that he had a solid foundation from which to operate. He didn't just rule the streets, he owned the streets, every inch of them. His men were disciplined, his networks extensive. They had all been carefully chosen for their skills, their loyalty, and their ability to get things done without drawing attention. Devon's methodical approach had allowed him to consolidate power in a way T-Bone never could. T-Bone, by contrast, was losing ground on all fronts. His attempts to rally his forces only pushed more of his men toward Devon's camp. The rumors were having their intended effect, and T-Bone's once feared reputation was now a liability. The very men who had fought by his side were now questioning his leadership. Whispers of betrayal grew louder, and even those closest to T-Bone began eyeing each other with suspicion. A violent reckoning was coming, but no one knew when or where it would happen. The final blow came on a cool autumn night, when a message was delivered to T-Bone in the form of an anonymous letter. The letter outlined the full extent of T-Bone's dwindling power, his failed alliances, the key lieutenants who had turned their backs on him, the business interests that were now being courted by Devon. The letter didn't just expose T-Bone's weaknesses, it exploited them. The message was clear, T-Bone was finished. It was only a matter of time before his empire collapsed. There would be no second chances, no resurgence. The end was near. T-Bone was livid when he read the letter. His pride burned with humiliation, but beneath the fury, he knew that the battle was over. His empire was crumbling from within, and his options were running out. But T-Bone wasn't a man to go down quietly. He had one last card to play, one final act of defiance. He called for a meeting with his most loyal men, preparing for a showdown that would either restore his reign or seal his fate. But Devon knew better than to wait for T-Bone's final desperate attempt to reclaim his power. Devon had already planned for this. The chess game was nearing its end, and all Devon had to do now was make the final move. In the days that followed, T-Bone's desperation became increasingly apparent. He ordered a series of attacks on Devon's men, hoping to instigate a full-blown war. But Devon remained calm. He had already anticipated this move. His crew was ready for T-Bone's final push, and they would not be caught off guard. It was no longer about reacting, it was about ending the conflict once and for all. T-Bone was digging his own grave, and Devon was the one holding the shovel. When T-Bone's men launched their last-ditch assault, Devon was prepared. He knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The time for subtle manipulation was over. Now, it was time for victory. The final confrontation was looming, and both Devon and T-Bone knew it. It was inevitable. T-Bone had become desperate, and in his desperation, he had become predictable. Devon, ever the strategist, had already anticipated this turn of events and had positioned himself accordingly. He knew that the war could only end in one of two ways, with T-Bone's final, desperate bid for power, or with his total annihilation. And Devon was prepared for either outcome. The events that followed were fast-paced and brutal. T-Bone's last-ditch efforts to regain control of the district were as reckless as they were doomed. His final assault on Devon's stronghold was a blatant attempt to reclaim some shred of power, but it was also a desperate cry for help. T-Bone wasn't just fighting for his empire, he was fighting for his very survival. But survival in the underworld came at a steep price, and Devon was more than willing to make T-Bone pay for his arrogance. It began with a series of coordinated attacks on Devon's operations, raids, ambushes, and violent encounters designed to unsettle his crew and shake their confidence. The attacks came at night, under the cover of darkness, as T-Bone's men hoped to catch Devon off guard. But Devon was never off guard. His men were ready, their loyalty unshaken by the earlier skirmishes. They had been trained for this moment. Devon had anticipated T-Bone's desperation and had prepared for it in advance. When T-Bone's men launched their assault, they found that Devon had already fortified his positions. The ambushes that were meant to cripple his empire only ended in failure. Devon's men were too well prepared, too disciplined. The ambushers were met with resistance at every turn, their plans unraveling before they could even get started. T-Bone's men had underestimated Devon's ability to stay one step ahead. The frustration within T-Bone's ranks was palpable as each attack fizzled out, and one by one, his lieutenants began to question his judgment. But Devon was not content with merely defending his territory. He had bigger plans, plans that would force T-Bone into a corner from which he could not escape. Devon understood that T-Bone's final attempt to regain control would likely be his last. The question was not whether T-Bone would lose, but how quickly he would be forced to realize that his reign was over. Devon's strategy was simple yet effective. Rather than engaging in open warfare, he sought to break T-Bone's spirit. Every failed attack, every defeat, was a blow to T-Bone's pride, a reminder that his empire was crumbling. Devon knew that T-Bone's biggest vulnerability was his ego. The more he was forced to retreat, the more his pride would push him to make reckless decisions. And that's exactly what Devon wanted. The next move in Devon's plan was to stage a series of public humiliations, attacks on T-Bone's remaining strongholds, ones that were strategically important to his empire. Devon's crew targeted key locations, warehouses, distribution centers, and businesses that were central to T-Bone's operations. The attacks were swift and calculated, leaving T-Bone's men scrambling to defend their positions. But by this point it was clear to everyone involved that T-Bone's empire was collapsing. His enemies began to circle like vultures, waiting for the final act. The stakes were higher than ever. Devon knew that T-Bone's next move would be a desperate one. In the underworld, desperation often led to mistakes, and Devon was counting on T-Bone's pride to blind him to the consequences of his actions. The next move was critical, and Devon needed to be in the right place at the right time to capitalize on T-Bone's impending downfall. As the situation continued to deteriorate for T-Bone, the pressure on him mounted. His men were losing faith, his alliances were dissolving, and his resources were dwindling. The whispers of betrayal had grown louder, and the once feared name of T-Bone was now spoken with contempt. But the man was nothing if not resilient. T-Bone refused to accept that his time had come. He began to make more desperate moves, sending out his remaining lieutenants to try and rally whatever support they could find. But it was too late. The people who had once feared him now saw him as a broken man, a man whose empire was slipping through his fingers. And then came the final mistake, the tipping point that would signal the end of T-Bone's reign. With his back against the wall, T-Bone decided to take the fight to Devon directly. In a final, last-ditch effort to turn the tide, he launched an all-out assault on one of Devon's most heavily guarded locations, his headquarters, the heart of his empire. It was a reckless move, driven by desperation. But in T-Bone's mind, it was the only option left. The attack came quickly and with full force. But Devon had already anticipated this. The moment T-Bone's forces moved in, Devon activated his own trap. His crew, having long since been prepared for such an assault, laid waste to T-Bone's men before they could even breach the outer perimeter. It was an ambush of a magnitude that T-Bone could never have imagined. His soldiers were outnumbered and outgunned. T-Bone's last-ditch effort to reclaim his throne ended in a bloodbath. As T-Bone's men were slaughtered, his final stronghold fell apart. The power that had once been his was now gone, replaced by defeat and humiliation. T-Bone himself was forced to flee the scene, leaving his empire in ruins. But the damage was done. The story of T-Bone's fall would be one of treachery, miscalculation, and the unrelenting tide of Devon's rise. For Devon, the victory was bittersweet. He had won, but he had also witnessed firsthand the devastation that the underworld could bring. The toll of war was always heavy, even for the victor. As T-Bone's men scattered, Devon couldn't help but reflect on the cost of their struggle. He had come to realize that power wasn't just about control, it was about knowing when to fight and when to wait. T-Bone had failed to understand that, and it was the reason for his downfall. In the end, T-Bone's empire lay in ruins, and Devon stood triumphant. But his victory came with a sense of finality, as if the weight of his triumph had already begun to settle in. The district, which had once trembled under T-Bone's rule, now looked to Devon as its new leader. The question, however, remained, would he be any different? Would his reign be marked by the same hubris that had brought T-Bone down? The story was far from over. The balance of power in the district had shifted, but the game was far from won. For now, Devon had claimed his victory, but in the underworld, the throne was never truly secure. As the dust settled from T-Bone's fall, the district began to breathe again, but the air was thick with uncertainty. While Devon had emerged victorious, the power vacuum left in T-Bone's wake was not as straightforward to fill as many might have believed. The people of the underworld, the dealers, the informants, the fixers, and even the enforcers, all had their own thoughts about the future, and Devon's rise was as much about managing these opinions as it was about asserting his authority. What followed was not just a consolidation of power, it was a battle to prove his legitimacy in the eyes of those who had served T-Bone, and those who had been waiting for an opportunity like this for years. Devon knew that simply being the last man standing wasn't enough. In this world, survival was only half of the equation. The real challenge was maintaining power, and to do so, Devon had to prove that he could not only lead but also manage the intricate web of relationships and alliances that held the district together. This was where the true test of his leadership began. To secure his dominance, Devon focused first on stabilizing the territory that T-Bone had once controlled. He knew that if he left any part of the district vulnerable or contested, his enemies would seize the chance to weaken him, to tear apart the empire he was beginning to build. It wasn't just about holding the streets, it was about holding the trust of the people who lived and worked on them. The residents, the business owners, the shopkeepers, the workers, they all needed to feel that their world wouldn't be turned upside down again. And more than that, they needed to believe that Devon's leadership would be steady, reliable, and perhaps even better than T-Bone's had been. But Devon also understood the delicate nature of loyalty in the criminal world. The men who had followed T-Bone, those who had bled for him, would not be easily swayed. They were loyal not just to the money, but to the old ways, the methods they had grown comfortable with. Many of these men would never accept Devon as their leader, no matter how much power he had accumulated. They would either bow to him, or they would make their stand. And so, in the days following T-Bone's downfall, Devon set about a meticulous campaign to win over both the hearts and minds of the district. His first move was to meet with T-Bone's inner circle, the men who had been closest to the now deposed leader. Devon knew that if he could win over the key lieutenants, those who controlled the major aspects of the district's business, then he would secure his position. But this would not be done through force alone. Devon was no tyrant, he was a negotiator, a planner, and a man who understood the importance of mutual benefit. He began with a quiet meeting, one-on-one, with each of T-Bone's remaining lieutenants. In these meetings, he offered them a choice: join him, work with him, or be replaced. But there was a subtle twist. Devon wasn't just offering them power, he was offering them respect, a seat at the table. He promised to treat them as equals, to share in the profits and decision-making of the district. But Devon also made it clear that loyalty would be demanded in return. He was not about to tolerate betrayal, and he would expect unwavering allegiance. The first of T-Bone's men to accept was Tony, the Snake, Delgado, a sharp and calculating figure who had always been a schemer. Delgado had seen the writing on the wall long before T-Bone's fall, and he knew which way the wind was blowing. Devon's offer to him wasn't just a way to stay in power, it was a lifeline. In exchange for his loyalty, Delgado was given control of several key businesses in the district, along with a significant cut of the profits. In turn, he pledged his allegiance to Devon, knowing full well that failing to do so would mean his swift and violent removal. Next came Salvatore, Sally the Bull, Moretti, a seasoned veteran of the streets who had been with T-Bone since the beginning. Moretti was a man of honor, old school in his ways, and the thought of bowing to Devon didn't sit well with him. But after much deliberation and a few subtle reminders of the consequences of defiance, Moretti grudgingly agreed to cooperate. He was given control over certain territories, a symbolic gesture of Devon's desire to keep the old order intact while still asserting his dominance. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. A few of T-Bone's most hot-headed lieutenants refused to submit, unwilling to bend the knee to a younger, more calculating man. They attempted to rally the remnants of T-Bone's supporters, hoping to form a coalition that could rise up against Devon's reign. But Devon was well aware of this threat. He knew that to face it head-on would only risk further bloodshed, and he wasn't interested in martyrdom. Instead, he allowed the discontent to simmer, carefully watching and waiting, knowing full well that such dissent would eventually collapse under its own weight. Those who refused to accept the new order would either be eliminated, driven out, or coerced into submission. Meanwhile, as the leadership struggle played out in the underworld, Devon worked hard to cultivate a different image of himself in the public eye. While his inner circle took care of the heavy lifting, Devon worked on restoring the faith of the business community and the public. The local shop owners, the politicians, and the influential figures who had been too frightened to align with T-Bone now had a chance to switch sides. Devon understood that he needed to build a stable, functioning economy to secure his position as the true boss of the district. The streets were one thing, but it was the businesses and the money behind them that truly held the power. In this, he was cautious, deliberate, and patient. He wasn't looking to make flashy, attention-grabbing moves. Instead, he sought to subtly and steadily weave himself into the fabric of the district's economy. He brokered deals with business owners, ensured that his operations were efficient, and started to foster a reputation for being a man who didn't just take, he gave back. It wasn't about charity, it was about securing loyalty through a shared stake in the future. The more he worked to solidify his power base, the more he realized that this wasn't just about the district. It was about becoming a figure whose influence could extend far beyond the boundaries of the Metro District. Devon's eyes were on a bigger prize, one that he could only achieve by first proving himself in the here and now. But to do so, he would need to balance the immediate needs of the district with the long-term strategy that had guided him thus far. Every day that passed seemed to bring him closer to his goal, but it was a slow burn. The old guard of T-Bone's reign wasn't going to fade quietly, and there were still remnants of his loyalists, those who had yet to be dealt with. Devon knew that the final phase of his campaign would require him to act decisively. He had outlasted the first wave of opposition, but the real test would come when his position was challenged directly, when his leadership would be called into question by those with nothing left to lose. But for now, as he watched the district begin to stabilize under his watchful eye, Devon couldn't help but think of the lessons that had brought him here. Patience, strategy, and the careful cultivation of relationships were as important as strength and power. And while the streets may have been his domain, Devon knew that the true key to his dominance lay in his ability to master the complex and often unpredictable nature of the criminal world. There was more work to be done, but Devon was more determined than ever to ensure that his reign would not only survive but thrive. As Devon's control over the district began to solidify, new challenges arose that tested his patience and ingenuity in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the old guards of T-Bone's empire who resisted him anymore, new players, hungry for power and eager to make their mark, started to emerge. These new threats weren't confined to the shadows of the streets but came in the form of more polished, sophisticated criminals with ambitions that reached far beyond the borders of the Metro District. One of the first signs that Devon's reign might not be as secure as he hoped came in the form of an outsider, Victor Vito Russo, a former enforcer for a rival crime family who had recently made a name for himself in the northern part of the city. Russo had moved into the Metro District with the intention of setting up his own operations, and his reputation for ruthlessness was already well known. He was everything that Devon wasn't, a brutish, blunt force figure who used fear and intimidation to carve out his territory. Vito was not the kind of criminal who played the long game. He was loud, aggressive, and had no interest in subtlety. His presence in the Metro District posed a direct challenge to Devon's carefully cultivated authority. Russo's men began to muscle in on Devon's turf, opening illegal gambling rings, extorting local businesses, and causing chaos wherever they went. The violence was escalating, and Devon knew that it was only a matter of time before he would have to confront Russo head-on. But Devon was no fool. He understood that in the world of organized crime, a direct confrontation with a man like Vito Russo would only result in bloodshed, something he wanted to avoid. What Devon needed was a strategy that would neutralize Russo's growing influence without tarnishing his own reputation or risking an all-out war. Devon's method was simple yet effective. He would outsmart Russo, make him look like the outsider he was, and let his own recklessness drive him into a corner. Devon began by sowing seeds of doubt among Russo's ranks. He reached out to a few key members of Russo's crew, men who had begun to question their boss's erratic leadership and growing violence. Through subtle whispers and carefully placed words, Devon began to paint Russo as a liability, someone whose brashness and lack of finesse would ultimately destroy everything he had built. At the same time, he began to lure away Russo's allies with promises of better opportunities under his own leadership. It wasn't long before the cracks in Russo's organization started to show. His men began to question their loyalty to him, and the defections started to trickle in. As more and more of Russo's trusted lieutenants began to shift their allegiance to Devon, Russo's power base weakened. But Devon knew this was just the beginning. He still needed to neutralize Vito Russo himself, and that required a more subtle touch. In a calculated move, Devon arranged for a meeting with Russo, something he knew would be risky, but necessary. Russo, arrogant and self-assured, agreed to meet Devon in a quiet part of the city, thinking it would be another negotiation, another opportunity to assert his own dominance. What he didn't know was that Devon had carefully orchestrated this meeting to tilt the scales in his favor. The location was crucial. Devon chose a place that was neither too public nor too secluded, a place where his men could maintain a strategic advantage without alarming Russo. It was an abandoned warehouse near the docks, a location that had long been a hub for illicit dealings. Devon arrived first, his men taking up positions around the perimeter, while he waited calmly for Russo's arrival. The tension in the air was thick, but Devon remained calm, his mind focused on the task at hand. When Russo finally arrived, flanked by his remaining loyalists, it was clear that he still believed he was in control of the situation. He strutted into the warehouse with a sense of entitlement, as though the very space belonged to him. But as he surveyed the room, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Russo wasn't the type to back down, but even he couldn't ignore the mounting sense of danger that seemed to close in on him. Devon greeted him with his usual calm demeanor, offering him a drink and a chair, but the tension between them was palpable. The meeting began with small talk, each man trying to size the other up. Devon remained cool, calm, and collected, while Russo's temper was barely contained. He wanted to throw his weight around, to challenge Devon's authority outright. But Devon wasn't interested in a confrontation. Instead, he played the role of the patient strategist, carefully guiding the conversation to his advantage. Over the course of the meeting, Devon slowly pushed Russo into a corner, using his own arrogance and overconfidence against him. He mentioned the defections, subtly suggesting that more of Russo's men were beginning to see the writing on the wall. He alluded to Russo's reckless violence, painting a picture of a man who was slowly losing control, not just of his territory, but of his reputation as well. Devon was careful, though, he didn't outright threaten Russo. Instead, he used insinuations and suggestions, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. In the end, it wasn't a physical altercation that ended Russo's challenge to Devon's rule. Instead, it was the slow realization that he had been outplayed, that his own actions had alienated those who had once supported him. Russo left the meeting seething, his pride wounded and his future uncertain. The next few days were tense, as Russo attempted to regroup and salvage what remained of his empire. But it was clear to anyone watching that his power was crumbling. Devon knew that it wouldn't be long before Russo made one last, desperate attempt to reclaim his position. But by then, it was too late. Russo had lost the support of his men, and his own lack of foresight had made him vulnerable. When the final confrontation came, it wasn't a dramatic shootout or an all-out war. Instead, it was a quiet, calculated takedown. Devon's men closed in on Russo's remaining strongholds, one by one, until there was nowhere left for him to run. Russo was caught, defeated not by force but by Devon's ability to play the long game. In the end, Vito Russo was eliminated from the equation, his name becoming another cautionary tale in the world of crime. For Devon, this victory further cemented his reputation as a leader who understood the true nature of power. It wasn't about brute strength, it was about intelligence, patience, and the ability to manipulate the pieces on the board. Devon's rise was no longer just a matter of survival, it was a matter of strategy, and he was the master of that game. The district, now fully under his control, was beginning to fall into place. But Devon knew that his work was far from done. Russo had been a significant threat, but there were always more challenges lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. For now, though, Devon had proven himself once again. His position was stronger than ever, and his empire was growing. With Vito Russo's defeat and the power struggles in the district now settling, Devon's rule seemed to be on the verge of total dominance. Yet, for all the progress he had made in securing his empire, the road ahead remained fraught with challenges. As his influence expanded, so did the complexity of the underworld he had inherited. The more he expanded his reach, the more he realized that the very things that had brought him success, his strategic mind, his ability to manipulate, and his knack for outlasting his enemies, were also the things that made him a target. As his control solidified, new threats began to emerge from the periphery of his world, not from rival gangs or power-hungry criminals, but from within. The cracks in his empire started to show in the form of betrayal. Devon had always known that loyalty in the criminal world was a fragile thing, built on fear, respect, and shared interests. But what he had failed to anticipate was the erosion of trust within his closest circle, the men who had once sworn allegiance to him, the lieutenants and enforcers who had been with him through thick and thin. As his power grew, so did his need for absolute control, and the men who had helped him rise now found themselves sidelined, their influence diminished. At first, the subtle shifts in behavior went unnoticed. The late-night meetings, the whispered conversations, the carefully timed absences, all of these things went by without Devon suspecting that the loyalty he had earned was beginning to fray. But as time wore on, the signs became more difficult to ignore. The first betrayal came from Tony, the snake, Delgado, the very man who had been one of his staunchest allies. Delgado had always been a man who valued money above all else, and as Devon's empire grew, so did the opportunities for greed. Delgado had started making secret deals with rival groups, pocketing profits from illicit activities that undermined Devon's operations. The betrayal was almost Shakespearean in its intricacy. Delgado's actions were not so overt as to spark an immediate conflict, but when Devon's lieutenants began to notice discrepancies in the books, unexplained shifts of money and resources, suspicion began to mount. At first, Devon dismissed the rumors. He trusted Tony. He had to. But as the whispers became louder, Devon started to see the cracks in his friend's loyalty. The carefully timed meetings with rival factions, the missing shipments, and the sudden influx of wealth, all of it pointed to one thing: Tony had been working behind his back, making deals that jeopardized everything Devon had built. It was in the midst of a particularly tense meeting with his senior advisors that the truth came out. Delgado, ever the charmer, tried to mask his nervousness, but Devon could see right through it. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken accusations. It was clear that Tony thought he could talk his way out of this, that his history with Devon would shield him from the consequences. But Devon wasn't the same man he had been when he first stepped into the game. He had learned the hard way that trust in this world was earned only through actions, not words. Devon called Tony out, confronting him with the evidence of his betrayal. The conversation was brief, but the tension in the room was suffocating. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Tony tried to deny it, but the weight of the proof was undeniable. There was no denying the truth. Tony's actions had put the entire operation at risk, and Devon could not allow that to stand. What followed was a ruthless decision. There would be no second chances. Devon had learned early on that mercy in this world was a sign of weakness, and weakness was something that would never be tolerated under his rule. He made the call, and Tony Delgado was removed from the equation. The decision wasn't made lightly. Devon had considered the man his friend, his partner, but loyalty was everything in this world, and Tony had proven that he couldn't be trusted. The betrayal wasn't just about money, it was about Devon's leadership, his ability to maintain control. Tony's actions had undermined that, and for that, he had to pay the price. In the aftermath of Delgado's removal, Devon took a long, hard look at his organization. The betrayal had been a wake-up call, a reminder that power, no matter how carefully managed, was always in danger of being torn apart by the very people who helped build it. And so, Devon set about reinforcing his leadership, not just through force, but through carefully chosen alliances and a renewed focus on loyalty. He had to make it clear that betrayal, in any form, would be punished swiftly and without mercy. But as the weeks went by, Devon found that the damage to his inner circle had only just begun. Tony Delgado's betrayal had left a ripple effect, and other members of his crew began to question their own positions. Some were loyal, truly loyal, to Devon, but others, like Salvatore, Sally the Bull, Moretti, began to feel uneasy. Moretti had been a pillar of support for Devon since his rise, but now, with the power dynamics shifting, there were whispers that Sally wasn't entirely happy with the new order. Moretti had always been a traditionalist, a man who believed in the old ways, the codes of honor that had governed the streets for decades. To him, Devon's brand of leadership, based more on calculation and manipulation than brute strength and loyalty, was something that needed to be watched carefully. Moretti began to make his own moves, talking to old contacts from T-Bone's crew, quietly rallying support for a return to the old ways. It wasn't long before Devon began to see signs of another conspiracy brewing within his ranks. Unlike Tony Delgado's subtle betrayal, Moretti's actions were more direct. He began to move resources around, stockpiling weapons and cash, and meeting with key figures in rival factions. The tension between him and Devon grew, but it wasn't until Devon's trusted advisors began to whisper that the true extent of the problem became clear. Moretti wasn't just dissatisfied, he was actively plotting to replace Devon. This time, Devon couldn't afford to be so trusting. He had learned from his mistakes, and he knew that the stakes were higher than ever. Moretti, like Tony, had crossed a line. He couldn't be allowed to continue in his role. But dealing with Moretti would require more than just a clean break, it would require a decisive move that would send a message to everyone in his organization that disloyalty would not be tolerated, no matter who the traitor was. Devon bided his time, watching carefully as Moretti's actions became bolder. He knew that confronting him directly would only spark a full-scale rebellion, and Devon was not interested in throwing his empire into chaos. Instead, he devised a plan that would make Moretti's betrayal public, a move that would leave him with no way out. In a carefully orchestrated series of events, Devon set up a trap for Moretti. He leaked false information about a major shipment of cash coming into the district, knowing that Moretti would see it as the perfect opportunity to make his move. When Moretti and his men tried to intercept the shipment, they walked straight into a carefully planned ambush. Devon's forces were waiting, and Moretti's fate was sealed. As the dust settled from the confrontation, Devon's reputation as a leader who would tolerate no betrayal was solidified. The remaining members of his crew, those who had been unsure or hesitant, now knew that there would be no mercy. Power, respect, and loyalty were earned through actions, not words, and Devon's actions spoke louder than anything he could say. The lesson had been learned. For Devon, the road to true power was fraught with betrayal, but it was also a reminder that survival was about constant vigilance, the ability to adapt, and the unflinching resolve to do whatever it took to hold on to what was his. As the dust settled from the betrayals that had rocked Devon's empire, he stood on the precipice of something larger, something more dangerous. His power was now unquestioned, his control of the Metro District absolute. Yet, there was an unsettling realization that came with this dominance. The higher one rose in the criminal world, the more vulnerable one became. The once loyal lieutenants and associates were no longer mere pawns in his game, they were potential threats, watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. It was no longer just about rival gangs or opportunistic outsiders, it was about maintaining his grip on the throne in a world where power could evaporate as quickly as it was seized. Devon's first sign that things weren't as secure as they seemed came when an old rival resurfaced. Marco, the butcher, Carbone, a notorious mob boss who had once ruled a sizable portion of the city's southern districts, had been out of the game for years. After a stint in prison, Marco had disappeared from the radar, leaving behind a wake of blood and rumors. But the silence had been shattered by whispers that Marco was coming back. The butcher's return wasn't just a rumor, it was a storm on the horizon. He was a man of brutal force, a living legend who had left a trail of carnage in his wake. His reputation alone was enough to send a chill down the spines of the city's criminals. For Devon, Marco's reappearance was a serious threat. Marco wasn't just any mob boss, he was a survivor, a man who had clawed his way to power through sheer violence and terror. And in a world where violence was often the answer, Marco's brutal efficiency could be a real problem for Devon, whose rise had been built on intelligence, manipulation, and strategy rather than overt aggression. The butcher didn't play by the same rules. He didn't need to outsmart his enemies, he just needed to break them, one bone at a time. The tension between the two men began to build as rumors of Marco's return turned into reality. Marco had his eyes on the Metro District, Devon's district. Devon knew that Marco wasn't someone who would settle for scraps. He wanted control. And he was willing to use any means necessary to get it. The stakes had never been higher. Devon couldn't afford to let his empire slip away to a man like Marco. But confronting Marco head-on was dangerous. A direct clash with such a formidable opponent would result in massive casualties on both sides. Devon needed to outthink Marco, to play the game in a way that would force his rival into a corner. But Marco wasn't the only problem. Devon had built his empire by making allies and forging partnerships with local businesses, politicians, and even law enforcement. He had played the game carefully, ensuring that his operations ran smoothly, with no one the wiser. But now, with Marco threatening his domain, Devon's web of alliances was starting to fray. His relationships with the city's key figures were being tested. The politicians who had once turned a blind eye to Devon's operations were now more hesitant, their loyalty wavering. The businesses that had once flourished under his protection were beginning to question their future. And worse yet, the police force, who had been under Devon's payroll for years, seemed to be tightening the leash. Corruption was still rampant, but there were murmurs of a new, more determined commissioner, a man with a personal vendetta against the criminal underworld. Devon realized that the very structures that had supported his rise were starting to crumble. At the same time, Devon found himself increasingly paranoid. The betrayals he had suffered, combined with Marco's looming presence, created an atmosphere of distrust within his own ranks. Devon's men had grown complacent, their loyalty taken for granted. And with the growing uncertainty of what Marco might do next, Devon felt the need to tighten his control over every aspect of his empire. No one could be trusted, not even those closest to him. Every meeting, every conversation, was now viewed through the lens of suspicion. Devon had no choice but to surround himself with an even more elite group of enforcers, men who were known for their discretion and efficiency, men who would do whatever it took to protect him. Despite his growing isolation, Devon knew he couldn't afford to be consumed by paranoia. He needed to maintain his focus, to continue thinking several moves ahead. Marco, for all his brutality, was still just one player in a much larger game. And this was a game that was far from over. Devon needed to adapt, to evolve, and above all, he needed to maintain control. The next move had to be calculated and precise. The opportunity came when Devon received intelligence about a major shipment Marco was planning, a shipment that would move through a vulnerable section of the city, an area where Devon had previously controlled all the movement of goods. Marco's men, unaware of the surveillance Devon had set up, were making the mistake of routing the shipment through one of Devon's old territories. It was a perfect opportunity for Devon to strike back without risking direct confrontation. He began planning the takedown, knowing that this could be the moment that shifted the balance of power in his favor. Devon's plan was simple yet elegant. Instead of going head-to-head with Marco's men, Devon would target the shipment itself. He knew that taking control of the shipment would not only disrupt Marco's operations but also send a clear message: Devon was still the master of the Metro District. He couldn't allow Marco to think for even a moment that Devon was weak or vulnerable. The shipment was more than just goods, it was a statement of dominance, and Devon intended to make sure that statement was his. Devon's men moved swiftly, taking control of the shipment in a carefully coordinated strike. It wasn't just about the cash or the merchandise, it was about showing Marco that Devon had the ability to hit where it hurt the most. The operation was flawless, and within hours, the shipment was in Devon's hands. Marco's men were left scrambling, unsure of what had just happened. It was a blow to Marco's pride, one that he would not forget. But the victory came at a cost. As Devon reveled in his success, he was reminded of the price of power. The momentary triumph was fleeting. He had proven himself once again, but the war was far from over. Marco would respond. And this time, he would be more dangerous, more determined. Devon knew that the next move was critical. The game was far from finished. The battle for control of the Metro District was heating up, and there was no turning back. The victory over Marco's shipment gave Devon a temporary sense of relief, but deep down, he knew that this victory was merely a prelude to something much more dangerous. Marco, the butcher, Carbone was not a man who could be defeated with one well-executed operation. If anything, the loss of such a valuable shipment would fuel his rage and desire for revenge. In the world Devon operated in, every action had a ripple effect, and the consequences of his latest move were only beginning to unfold. Marco's retribution came swiftly. The retaliation wasn't in the form of a direct assault on Devon's life or empire, as many expected. Marco understood that brute force alone would not win him this war. Instead, he played a much more insidious game. He began targeting the very foundation of Devon's success, his allies. As the underworld knew well, alliances were everything in this game, and Devon's network of political figures, business owners, and law enforcement officers was his greatest strength. Marco, using his influence and reputation, began to sow discord within those circles. It started with a few rumors, strategically placed in the right ears. Marco's men whispered doubts into the ears of some of Devon's key allies, planting seeds of mistrust and suspicion. The politicians who had once turned a blind eye to Devon's activities began to grow more hesitant in their dealings. Business owners who had enjoyed protection for years now found themselves questioning whether aligning with Devon was worth the risk. Even some of the officers who had long been in Devon's pocket began to show signs of wavering loyalty. At first, Devon didn't take Marco's subtle sabotage seriously. After all, his grip on power had seemed unshakable, his influence unquestioned. He had always been able to play the political game better than anyone, outsmarting his rivals and manipulating those in power to his advantage. But slowly, as the weeks passed, Devon began to feel the weight of Marco's tactics. One by one, his allies began to pull away, some with quiet exits, others with more overt signs of defection. Devon's empire, once a well-oiled machine, was beginning to show signs of strain. The most significant blow came when the city's police commissioner, who had long been under Devon's thumb, suddenly announced a crackdown on organized crime. The commissioner, a man who had been bought and paid for, was now openly distancing himself from Devon's operation. Rumors swirled that the commissioner had been meeting with Marco, and many believed that a deal had been struck. The sudden shift in law enforcement's attitude was a direct threat to Devon's operations. His empire had thrived in part because of his ability to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. With the commissioner now openly hostile, Devon found himself in a perilous position. At the same time, his relationship with the city's business community grew increasingly strained. Several key businesses began pulling back, no longer willing to pay for Devon's protection. Some claimed it was because of the increased police pressure, others suggested that they were simply afraid of Marco's growing influence. Whatever the reason, Devon could feel the walls closing in. His control was slipping. Devon had always been able to outthink his opponents, but now he was forced to confront the possibility that Marco's influence was growing faster than his own. He couldn't let his empire crumble. He couldn't afford to lose the ground he had worked so hard to gain. But what could he do when the very foundations of his power, his alliances, his political connections, were crumbling before his eyes? In an attempt to salvage his position, Devon called a series of private meetings with his remaining allies. His first target was a business magnate, Sammy the Ox, Blanchard, who had long been one of Devon's closest supporters. Sammy controlled a series of legitimate businesses that helped launder money for Devon's operations, and his loyalty had been invaluable. However, Sammy had recently begun to pull back, his interest waning as the police pressure mounted. Devon needed to remind Sammy of the mutual benefits they both enjoyed. The meeting took place in a quiet, upscale restaurant, far from the prying eyes of the city. Sammy, a stocky man with a thick neck and a nervous disposition, had always been easy to manipulate, but he was also smart enough to know when the tides were turning. As Devon sat across from him, he could see the unease in Sammy's eyes. The once solid loyalty between them had begun to erode, and Devon knew that if he didn't act fast, he could lose him for good. "I hear you're not happy with the way things are going, Sammy," Devon said, his tone calm, almost soothing. "I get it. It's tough out there right now. But we've been through worse, haven't we?" Sammy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "It's not just the pressure, Devon. It's the heat from the cops. They're on to us, and you know it. Every move I make, every deal I set up, the cops are right there. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this going." Devon leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You and I both know the cops are just pawns, Sammy. They always have been. What we've got here is something bigger than that. The real power isn't in the cops or the city government, it's in the streets, the businesses, the networks. And I've made sure we control that. You're safe, Sammy, as long as you stay with me. You've been with me through thick and thin, and I'm not going to let that change now." There was a pause as Sammy looked away, conflicted. But Devon could see the hesitation in his eyes beginning to fade. He had always known how to manipulate people, how to speak to their fears and desires. Sammy's loyalty, though wavering, was still within reach. And Devon wasn't about to lose him. Slowly, Sammy's resistance crumbled, and the old alliance was reforged. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to keep the cracks from spreading too quickly. Next, Devon turned his attention to the police commissioner, a man named James Hutton, whose loyalty had always been a matter of convenience rather than devotion. Devon had bought Hutton's allegiance years ago, using a mix of favors, blackmail, and political maneuvering. But with the increasing pressure from Marco, it seemed that Hutton was no longer willing to toe the line. Devon knew that Hutton had one weakness, his ambition. Hutton wanted to rise higher in the ranks, to be a power player in the city's politics. Devon had always known how to exploit that ambition. The conversation with Hutton was less about intimidation and more about opportunity. Devon needed to remind the commissioner of what was at stake. "You want to climb the ladder, Jim," Devon said, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. "I get it. But that's not going to happen if you let Marco Carbone take over. You've seen what he's done to your department, what he's done to the city. If you want to stay relevant, you'll need me. We're in this together, whether you like it or not. And right now, it's better for both of us if we deal with Marco before he becomes a real problem." Hutton hesitated, his eyes flickering with doubt. But Devon knew he had the upper hand. With the right push, he could bring Hutton back into the fold. And if he could secure the loyalty of the commissioner, it would be a massive blow to Marco's plans. The tide of the battle was turning. But the war was far from over. Marco's threat had revealed just how fragile the alliances Devon had spent years building truly were. And though he had managed to regain some ground, he knew that his next moves would have to be even more calculated. The real fight was just beginning, and this time, it wouldn't be just about money, it would be about survival. The precarious balance of power in Devon's empire was shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. The alliances he had fought so hard to maintain were starting to fracture, but his most immediate concern was Marco. The butcher, a man known for his ruthlessness, was not one to back down after losing a shipment. Devon could feel the tension thickening in the air. Marco's retaliations had begun in earnest, subtle at first, but now the stakes were much higher. It wasn't just about the Metro District anymore. Marco had set his sights on destabilizing Devon's entire network. He wasn't going to just wait for Devon to make a mistake. Marco was playing the long game, taking careful, calculated steps to cripple Devon's influence over the city's underworld. The rumors about Marco's growing power were more than just whispers. He was quietly aligning with rival factions, sowing discord in places Devon had assumed were loyal. One night, after a routine meeting with a few of his men, Devon received news that shook him to his core. A group of his most trusted associates had been found dead in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The crime scene was brutal, and it was clear this wasn't a random act of violence. It bore the signature of Marco's men, swift, efficient, and utterly merciless. The message was clear: Devon was no longer untouchable. Marco wasn't just targeting his business, he was targeting the very foundation of trust and loyalty that Devon had built his empire upon. Devon couldn't afford to mourn his losses, though the sting of betrayal was deep. He had always known that his position was precarious, that the constant fight for power left little room for weakness. But this felt personal. These were the men who had been by his side from the beginning, the ones who had fought in the trenches with him. Now, they were gone. It was a blow that sent ripples through his ranks. If Marco could wipe out Devon's closest allies so easily, who was next? Would anyone be safe? The fear began to spread like wildfire. Some of his men, once loyal to the end, were now questioning their futures. The threat of Marco was more than just physical, it was psychological. Devon could feel the growing paranoia seeping into his own mind, a constant reminder that in this world, loyalty was often fleeting. Devon had to act, and he had to act quickly. This wasn't just about defending what was his anymore, it was about reclaiming control before Marco's shadow grew too long. But the more he thought about it, the more complicated the situation became. Every move he made could be another step into Marco's trap. And he knew that Marco would never give up until Devon was finished. He needed a new strategy, one that would force Marco into the open, one that would put him on the defensive for once. But such a strategy would require allies, and with every passing day, Devon found himself trusting fewer and fewer people. As the pressure mounted, Devon felt the walls closing in. He was no longer the calculating boss he once was. The weight of his empire was heavy on his shoulders, and it seemed like every decision he made only added to the complexity of his situation. Yet despite everything, Devon wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance to turn the tide. The aftermath of the failed arms deal weighed heavily on Devon. The once solid foundation of his power now seemed increasingly fragile, each move he made more desperate than the last. Marco Carbone had proven that he was not just a thug with a sharp blade, but a strategic mastermind capable of anticipating every one of Devon's moves. This failure wasn't just a setback, it was a stark reminder that the underworld was no longer a place where brute force could guarantee success. Devon knew that he had to shift his approach. His empire, built on calculated risks and a web of alliances, was now threatened not just by external enemies but by the instability within. Marco had exposed the cracks in Devon's leadership, and now it was up to Devon to seal them. But this time, he would have to be more cunning, more subtle. He couldn't afford another misstep. The stakes were higher than ever before, and if he couldn't regain control of his empire, everything he had worked for would crumble. The game was far from over, and Devon had only one option: adapt or fall.